Hey, tonight we're going to step back into the elegant but restrictive world of Victorian England, where love was a carefully orchestrated dance and marriage was more business transaction than romance. We'll discover why being a Victorian wife required skills you never learned in school and strength you never knew you'd need. Hey, if you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. I'm curious where you're listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Now, find a cozy spot, take a slow, deep breath, and let your body sink into comfort as we journey back in time together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1860 as an 18-year-old woman in Victorian England. The morning light filters through heavy velvet curtains, and you can feel the weight of your thick cotton nightgown against your skin. Your feet hit the cold wooden floor, and immediately you're reminded that central heating doesn't exist yet. The chill seeps through the floorboards and wraps around your ankles like invisible fingers. You're about to enter what Victorian society calls your season, and everything in your life is about to change forever. But here's the thing, you don't get to fall in love the way you might imagine. You can't swipe right, you can't text, and you definitely can't be alone with someone you're attracted to. Not even for a minute. Your mother appears in the doorway, her face serious. Today, darling, we begin preparing you for society. Her words carry weight because this isn't about parties or fun. This is about finding a husband, and it's treated with the same gravity as a military campaign. The good news is you're considered ready for this world now that you're 18. The bad news? Every single thing you do from this moment forward will be watched, judged and recorded in the mental notebooks of every person you meet. Your reputation is like a soap bubble, beautiful but so fragile that one wrong move will pop it forever. You might think Victorian courtship was romantic, all handwritten letters and stolen glances. And yes, there was romance, but it bloomed under conditions so strict they'd make a modern teenager feel claustrophobic. Every conversation, every look, every tiny gesture had to follow rules that weren't written down anywhere, but everyone somehow knew. Your mother helps you into your stays, the Victorian version of a bra and back support combined. People today imagine these as torture devices, but really they're more like a very structured undershirt. The laces pull snug around your ribs, not crushing but supportive. You can breathe just fine, though taking a really deep breath requires a conscious effort. The stays push your shoulders back and make you stand straighter, and honestly, your posture does look better. Over the stays goes your chemise, a soft cotton layer that feels cool against your skin. Then come the petticoats, layers of white cotton that rustle softly as you move. The sound is oddly comforting, like gentle rain on leaves. Finally, your dress, a morning gown in pale blue wool that makes your skin look porcelain smooth in the mirror. But here's what you're really wearing, an invisible set of rules so complex they'd make modern dating advice look simple. First rule, you cannot, under any circumstances, be alone with a gentleman unless you're already engaged to him. Not for a walk, not for a conversation, not even to step into the next room for a moment. If you want to talk to a man, someone else has to be watching, always. This means your mother, your sister, your aunt, or a paid chaperone follows you everywhere. Think of the most helicopter parent you know, then multiply that by 10. Your chaperone's job is to make sure you never have a chance to do anything that might damage your reputation. And trust me, Victorian society had very creative ideas about what could damage a young woman's reputation. You can't write a letter to a gentleman unless you're engaged. You can't accept a gift from him unless it's something small and public, like flowers or a book. You can't even shake his hand for too long. A brief gloved touch is acceptable. Anything more is scandalous. You might wonder how anyone ever managed to fall in love under these conditions. Well, love found a way, but it had to be patient and very, very clever, which brings us to one of the most ingenious communication systems ever invented. The language of the fan. Every well-bred Victorian lady carried a fan, and not just for cooling herself in stuffy ballrooms. That innocent-looking accessory was actually a sophisticated messaging system that would make modern texting look primitive. Your mother sits you down for what she calls fan lessons, though she doesn't call it that out loud. A lady, she says, opening her own ivory fan with a soft snap, speaks with more than just her voice. She holds the fan closed against her left cheek. This means no. Then she moves it to her right cheek. This means yes. She fans herself slowly. This means I am spoken for. Then quickly. This means I wish to speak with you. You practice these movements until they feel natural. Closing the fan with your left hand means you wish to get acquainted. Opening and closing it repeatedly means you want to kiss. Drawing it across your forehead means we are being watched. Dropping it means we belong to each other. It's like learning a secret code, and in many ways that's exactly what it is. Victorian women denied the freedom to speak openly about their feelings, created their own language. They turned a simple cooling device into a tool of rebellion, a way to say what society wouldn't let them say with words. But the fan language only works if someone knows how to read it. So mothers teach daughters, and older women whisper the meanings to younger ones. It becomes a conspiracy of femininity, a shared secret that makes the restrictive rules of courtship just slightly more bearable. Your first test comes at a local dinner party. You're wearing your best evening dress, dark green silk that rustles like whispered secrets when you walk. The neckline is modest by modern standards, but daring for daytime wear, showing just the suggestion of your collarbone. Your hair is piled high in an elaborate style that took your maid an hour to perfect, with tiny pearl pins that catch the candle light. The parlour is warm and golden, lit by dozens of candles that make everything look soft and romantic. The air smells of beeswax and rose water, with underlying hints of the roast beef being prepared in the kitchen. Your stomach growls softly, but you ignore it. Ladies don't acknowledge hunger in public. A young gentleman approaches, properly introduced by your hostess, Mr. Charles Whitmore, second son of a local landowner. He's pleasant-looking, with kind brown eyes and a nervous smile that suggests he's as uncertain about these social rules as you are. Miss Harrison, he says with a bow that's exactly the right depth, neither too casual nor too formal. I understand you enjoy reading. I do, sir, you reply, conscious that your mother is watching from across the room while pretending to examine the flower arrangements. I recently finished a most interesting novel. Might I inquire which one? This is where the conversation becomes a delicate dance. You want to seem intelligent, but not too intellectual. Accomplished, but not intimidating. Interesting, but not opinionated. It's exhausting, honestly. Jane Eyre, you say, testing the waters. It's a somewhat daring choice, given that the novel deals with passion and social criticism, but it's popular enough to be respectable. His eyes light up. Ah, Miss Bronte's work. I found it quite compelling, though perhaps a bit intense for some tastes. You realise he's testing you too, trying to figure out if you're the sort of woman who can handle intensity or if you prefer your literature as bland as unseasoned soup. You make a decision that feels both brave and terrifying. You open your fan halfway and hold it in your right hand. The message, if he knows the code, is clear. I like you, but proceed carefully. He glances at the fan, and you see understanding flicker in his eyes. He knows the language. Perhaps, he says quietly, you might recommend another novel the next time we meet? You draw the fan slowly across your cheek. I would be delighted to, sir. What you've just done is arrange a future conversation without actually arranging anything at all. If your mother overheard, she would hear only polite discussion of literature, but you and Mr. Whitmore have agreed to meet again and continue this careful exploration of each other's minds. The evening continues with more conversations, more careful navigation of social rules. You dance, but only certain dances and only with partners your mother approves of. The quadrille is acceptable because it involves multiple couples and limited physical contact. The waltz is daring because partners hold each other, though still at a proper distance. When Mr. Whitmore asks you to waltz, you feel your heart speed up. For the 3 minutes of the dance, his gloved hand rests lightly on your waist and your gloved hand touches his shoulder. It's the most intimate physical contact you're allowed to have with any man who isn't your husband, and the sensation is both thrilling and strange. You can feel the warmth of his hand through the layers of fabric. When he guides you through a turn, you catch a hint of his cologne, something woodsy and masculine that makes you slightly dizzy. For just a moment, you understand why these dances are considered scandalous by the strictest members of society. But all too soon, the music ends and he bows while you curtsy. The magical moment is over, and you're back to carefully chaperoned conversation and meaningful glances across crowded rooms. This is how Victorian courtship works. 3 minutes of dancing feels revolutionary, and holding someone's hand without gloves on would be absolutely shocking. Everything is heightened because everything is restricted. A smile becomes significant because it's all you're allowed to offer. A meaningful look carries the weight of a love letter because you can't actually send love letters. As the weeks pass, you and Mr. Whitmore develop a relationship through the most carefully orchestrated encounters imaginable. You happen to meet at the same lending library on Tuesday afternoons. You're both invited to the same dinner parties and musical evenings. Your mothers, who are not fools, notice this pattern and approve. But even as this gentle courtship develops, you're beginning to understand that marriage in Victorian England isn't really about love at all. It's about money, property, and social advancement. Love, if it happens, is considered a pleasant bonus. Your father has already had conversations with Mr. Whitmore's father, not about whether you two like each other, but about the financial arrangements that would make a marriage possible. These men are negotiating a contract that will govern the rest of your life, and you won't see the terms until after everything is decided. Mr. Whitmore's family wants to know exactly how much money your father will provide as your dowry. Your father wants to know what Mr. Whitmore stands to inherit and how he plans to support a wife. Both families are calculating whether this union will improve their social standing, increase their wealth, or provide useful business connections. You're not consulted about any of this. You're the prize in the negotiation, not a participant in it. But you are fortunate because your parents actually seem to care whether you like your potential husband. Many girls aren't so lucky. Some Victorian women meet their future husbands for the first time at their engagement parties. Some are married off to pay family debts or secure business partnerships, regardless of their feelings. Your friend Margaret whispers to you at another party that her cousin Emily was promised to a man 40 years her senior because his shipping business could save Emily's father from bankruptcy. Emily had never even spoken to the man before their wedding day. At least he's kind to her, Margaret says, but you both know that kindness from a stranger isn't the same thing as love from someone you've chosen. The more you learn about marriage, the more you understand that you're about to enter a legal arrangement that will fundamentally change who you are. Once you say, "I do," you'll legally cease to exist as an independent person. Everything you own will belong to your husband. Every decision about your life will be his to make. You'll even lose the right to your own children if something goes wrong. The law calls it coverture, and it means that a married woman is covered by her husband's legal identity. She disappears into his existence like a drop of water absorbed by a sponge. But tonight, you're still yourself. You're still Miss Harrison, with your own thoughts and dreams, and the right to own property and make decisions. You can still change your mind about Mr. Whitmore if you want to, though the social pressure to marry someone suitable grows stronger every day. Victorian society doesn't believe in old maids. A woman who doesn't marry is considered a failure, a burden on her family, and slightly pitiable. She'll spend her life dependent on male relatives, moving from her father's house to her brother's house, always a guest in someone else's life. So you practice your fan language and perfect your conversation skills and hope that Mr. Whitmore is as kind as he seems, because this careful dance of courtship is leading to a permanent arrangement that will define the rest of your existence. As you lie in bed at night, listening to the wind rattle the windows, you think about the women who came before you, your mother, your grandmother, all the women who navigated these same rules and restrictions. Some found happiness despite the limitations. Others learned to find contentment in duty and respectability. But all of them, every single one, had to surrender their legal identity and personal freedom in exchange for the social respectability that comes with marriage. It's the price Victorian women pay for security, for a place in society, for the protection of a man's name and income. Tomorrow, you'll put on your stays and your layers of petticoats and your carefully modest dress. You'll practice your fan language and perfect your smile and continue the elaborate dance of Victorian courtship, because this is how women survive in 1860, by following the rules perfectly and hoping the man they marry will be kind. The candle flame flickers in the draught, casting dancing shadows on the wallpaper. Soon you'll blow it out and sleep in the darkness, dreaming perhaps of a future where love and choice walk hand in hand. But when you wake, you'll be back in a world where women's dreams are always secondary to men's plans, and where the greatest adventure allowed to you is the careful navigation of someone else's expectations. Sleep now and rest well, because tomorrow the dance continues, and there's still so much more of this story to tell. The morning arrives when everything changes forever. Mr. Whitmore, now simply Charles in the privacy of your thoughts, has asked your father for your hand in marriage. The negotiation took place in your father's study over brandy and cigars, while you sat in the morning room pretending to embroider and straining to catch fragments of conversation through the heavy oak door. You hear the low rumble of masculine voices, occasional laughter, and the scratch of pen on paper. They're drawing up the marriage settlement, a legal document that will govern every aspect of your financial future, the dowry your father will provide, the property that will be held in trust, the arrangements for any children you might have. Your entire life is being planned and documented in that room, and you're not invited to participate. When Charles emerges, his face is flushed with success and what might be genuine happiness. Your father follows, looking satisfied in the way men do when they've completed a good business transaction. "My dear," your father says, taking your hands in his, "Mr. Whitmore has something to ask you." This is the moment you've been preparing for, but it still feels surreal. Charles takes your hands, his gloves soft against your fingers, and asks the question that will determine the rest of your existence. "Miss Harrison, would you do me the honour of becoming my wife?" You say yes because that's what you're supposed to do, and because you genuinely like him, and because refusing would create a scandal that would follow you forever. But as the words leave your lips, you feel something shift inside you, like a door closing on a room you'll never enter again. The engagement period passes in a whirlwind of preparations. Your mother takes you to London for your trousseau, the collection of clothes and household linens that will see you through your first years of marriage. You spend hours in drapers' shops, running your fingers over bolts of silk and cotton, choosing fabrics for morning dresses, afternoon gowns, and the elaborate evening wear that married women are expected to possess. The wedding dress requires 6 fittings: white silk with tiny seed pearls sewn into intricate patterns, sleeves that button from wrist to elbow with 32 covered buttons each, and a train that requires 2 small bridesmaids to manage. When you stand before the mirror in the dressmaker's shop, you look like a beautiful stranger, a porcelain figurine dressed for display. But beneath the white silk, you're learning lessons your mother never explicitly taught you. Other married women, speaking in lowered voices over tea, share fragments of information about what to expect on your wedding night. The advice is vague and contradictory, leaving you more confused than informed. Be patient with your husband, says Mrs. Thornfield, a woman who's been married 15 years and has 6 children. Men have needs that women must accommodate. Remember your duty, adds Mrs. Pemberton, her voice tight with something that might be remembered pain. A wife's primary obligation is to provide her husband with heirs. Nobody explains exactly what this duty involves, but you gather it's something physical, probably uncomfortable, and definitely not discussed in polite society. You're supposed to understand through intuition what generations of women have learned through experience, often painful experience. The wedding day arrives with the kind of October weather that makes everything look like a watercolour painting. Golden light slants through the church windows, illuminating dancing dust motes that remind you of fairy tales. Your dress rustles like whispered secrets as you walk down the aisle on your father's arm, and for a moment the ceremony feels genuinely magical. Charles looks handsome in his morning coat, his brown eyes warm as you approach the altar. The vicar's voice echoes in the high-ceilinged space as he leads you through vows that sound romantic until you really listen to the words. Do you promise to love, honour and obey your husband? The vicar asks, and you hear the legal weight behind each word. Love might be optional, but honour and obedience are requirements. You're legally promising to submit to Charles's authority in all things, forever. When you say, I do, you feel the invisible chains of coverture settle around you like a heavy cloak. In the eyes of the law, Miss Harrison dies in that moment, and Mrs. Whitmore is born. But Mrs. Whitmore isn't really a person, she's an extension of her husband, a possession with no independent legal existence. The wedding breakfast is a blur of congratulations, rich food and champagne that makes your head feel light and floaty. Your new mother-in-law kisses your cheek and welcomes you to the family with words that sound warm but feel like a transfer of ownership. You're no longer your father's responsibility, you're now your husband's property. The journey to your new home takes 3 hours by carriage over roads that jar your teeth and make your elaborate hairstyle list dangerously to one side. Charles sits beside you, making conversation about the countryside and the house you'll share, but there's an undercurrent of nervous anticipation that makes both of you speak a little too quickly. Whitmore Hall is smaller than your father's estate, but beautifully maintained, with ivy climbing the stone walls and gardens that show evidence of careful tending. The staff lines up to meet you. Mrs. Crawford, the housekeeper, cook, 2 housemaids, a parlourmaid, and a scullery girl who can't be more than 14. These people will look to you for direction, and you suddenly realise you have no idea how to run a household. Your mother taught you to embroider and speak French and play the pianoforte, but nobody ever explained how to manage servants or plan meals for a week or deal with tradesmen who deliver inferior goods. You're expected to know these things instinctively, or perhaps to learn them through trial and embarrassing error. Mrs. Crawford, a stern-faced woman with steel grey hair, shows you through the house with the air of someone presenting evidence. The master prefers his breakfast at precisely 8 o'clock, she informs you. Kippers on Tuesday and Friday, eggs and bacon the other days. He takes his tea strong with 1 lump of sugar. You nod and try to memorise these details, understanding that your husband's comfort is now your primary responsibility. If his breakfast is late or his tea too weak, it will be your fault, not the cook's. The house feels enormous after the familiar spaces of your childhood home, rooms upon rooms filled with furniture that belongs to Charles's family, decorated according to his mother's taste, organised around his preferences and routines. You're a guest in your own home, and you suspect you'll feel that way for months or perhaps years to come. Your bedroom is connected to Charles's by a dressing room, an arrangement that allows for privacy while maintaining the easy access that marriage apparently requires. The bed is enormous, with heavy curtains that can be drawn for warmth and privacy. Looking at it makes your stomach flutter with nervousness about what will happen when the sun sets. Mrs. Crawford shows you the household accounts, thick ledgers that track every penny spent on candles, soap, coal and food. The previous Mrs. Whitmore, God rest her soul, was very particular about the accounts, she says. She checked every entry and questioned any expense over 2 shillings. You stare at the neat columns of figures and realise you're looking at your future. Every day you'll need to review these accounts, manage the household budget, and make decisions about expenditures that could affect your family's financial standing. If you spend too much on groceries, Charles will notice. If you spend too little and the quality suffers, Charles will notice that too. The weight of responsibility settles on your shoulders like a heavy shawl. You're now accountable for the smooth running of a household that employs 6 people and maintains the social standards expected of a gentleman's family. One poorly planned dinner party could damage Charles's business relationships. One incident of poor housekeeping could reflect badly on his social standing. As evening approaches, your new lady's maid, a young woman named Sarah, helps you out of your wedding dress and into a nightgown that feels simultaneously too revealing and too concealing. The white cotton is softer than anything you've ever worn, but it's designed for a purpose you don't fully understand. Charles knocks on the connecting door with the kind of politeness that suggests he's as nervous as you are. When you tell him to enter, he appears in a dressing gown that makes him look older and more serious than the young man who courted you with such careful propriety. What happens next is awkward, uncomfortable, and nothing like the romance novels you've secretly read. Charles is gentle and patient, but the physical reality of marriage is startling and painful in ways nobody prepared you for. Afterward, as you lie in the darkness, listening to his breathing gradually slow into sleep, you understand why married women speak of duty rather than pleasure. This is what you've traded your independence for, the legal right to be owned by a man who seems kind but is essentially a stranger, the social respectability that comes with marriage, and the security of never having to worry about becoming an old maid. It's not a bad trade, necessarily, but it's final and irreversible. The next morning brings your first real test as mistress of the house. You wake to find Charles already dressed and in his study, attending to correspondence that requires his immediate attention. The servants are waiting for your instructions about the day's meals, and you realise you have no idea what Charles likes for breakfast beyond Mrs. Crawford's brief summary. You make your way to the kitchen, still feeling strange in your new role. Cook, a plump woman with flour permanently dusted on her apron, looks at you expectantly. "What would you like for dinner tonight, ma'am?" she asks, and you understand that this question will be repeated every single day for the rest of your married life. You suggest roast beef because it seems like the sort of thing gentlemen enjoy, and Cook nods approvingly, but then she asks about vegetables and sauces and whether you'll be having soup as a first course, and you realise that planning even one meal involves dozens of decisions you've never had to make. In your father's house, these choices were made by your mother or the housekeeper. You ate what appeared on your plate and never questioned how it got there. Now you're responsible for feeding not just Charles, but any guests he might invite, and you're expected to do it on a budget that balances economy with social expectations. The Morning Post brings your first lesson in how marriage changes even the simplest interactions. A letter arrives addressed to Mrs. Charles Whitmore, and it takes you a moment to realise they mean you. Your own name, the one you've answered to for 18 years, no longer officially exists. You're now defined entirely by your relationship to your husband. Even more disconcerting is the realisation that you can't open the letter without Charles's permission. As a married woman, you have no legal right to receive mail independently. Everything that comes to the house belongs to him, including correspondence addressed to you. Charles finds you staring at the letter in confusion and gently explains that it's from a local ladies' charitable society, inviting you to join their committee. You should accept, he says, and you understand that this isn't really a suggestion. As his wife, you're expected to participate in the social activities that reflect well on his standing in the community. The weeks that follow blur together in a routine of domestic management that's both overwhelming and surprisingly dull. You wake each morning to plan meals, review accounts, and supervise servants. You receive calls from other ladies in the afternoon, making conversation about weather and local gossip while carefully avoiding any topics that might be considered inappropriate. Your days are full but curiously empty. You're busy from morning to night, but the tasks feel disconnected from anything you care about. You're maintaining a household, fulfilling social obligations, and supporting your husband's career, but you're not really living your own life anymore. The charitable committee meetings provide a glimpse into the lives of other married women, and what you see isn't entirely encouraging. Mrs. Blackwood always wears long sleeves, even on warm days, and sometimes winces when she thinks no one is looking. Mrs. Turner speaks of her husband with a deference that borders on fear. Mrs. Hamilton mentions casually that she hasn't been allowed to visit her sister in 2 years because her husband disapproves of the connection. These women smile and chat about organising funds for orphans, but underneath their polite conversations, you sense a current of resigned endurance. They've all made the same trade you've made, surrendering their independence for security, and some of them are clearly having second thoughts. But complaining isn't an option. Victorian wives are expected to be grateful for their husband's protection and support, regardless of how that protection manifests itself. A woman who speaks against her husband publicly faces social ostracism and potential legal consequences. Marriage is a lifetime contract with no escape clause. Charles, to his credit, seems genuinely concerned with your happiness. He asks about your day, listens to your concerns about managing the household, and gently corrects your mistakes without making you feel foolish. But even his kindness comes with an undercurrent of authority that reminds you of your new position in the world. When you suggest subscribing to a literary magazine, he considers the request seriously before deciding it might not be suitable for a lady. When you mention wanting to learn more about managing the household accounts, he explains that such details would only worry your pretty head unnecessarily. His intentions are protective, but the effect is infantilizing. You're beginning to understand that marriage hasn't just changed your legal status, it's changed your entire identity. You're no longer expected to have opinions about politics, literature, or even your own life. Your thoughts and desires are supposed to align automatically with your husband's, as if saying "I do" had somehow merged your consciousness with his. The physical aspects of marriage remain uncomfortable and bewildering. Charles is patient and tries to be gentle, but there's a fundamental disconnect between what he needs from these encounters and what you experience. You submit because it's your duty, but the pleasure that poets write about remains mysteriously absent. Other women hint that this is normal, that wives aren't supposed to enjoy the physical side of marriage. Close your eyes and think of England, Mrs. Pemberton advises with a bitter smile, but you can't help wondering if there's something wrong with you, or if this is simply another sacrifice women make for the privilege of respectability. As winter settles over the countryside, you find yourself spending long hours staring out windows at the bare trees and grey skies. The house feels like a beautiful prison, comfortable but confining. You have everything a woman is supposed to want: security, social standing, a kind husband, and a well-appointed home, but you feel strangely hollow inside. The woman you used to be, the one who had opinions and dreams and the legal right to own property, feels like a character from a book you read long ago. Mrs. Charles Whitmore is a different person entirely, one whose existence is defined entirely by her usefulness to others. You're learning to be content with this new identity, because contentment is the best most Victorian wives can hope for. Love might grow with time, happiness might be found in small domestic pleasures, and fulfillment might come through children and charitable work. But the wild freedom of choice, the intoxicating possibility of self-determination, those things are gone forever. Tonight, as you brush your hair before the bedroom mirror, you catch a glimpse of someone who looks like you but feels like a stranger. She's well-dressed, well-cared for, and apparently well-adjusted to her new life. But in her eyes, if you look carefully, you can see the ghost of the girl who used to believe the world was full of possibilities. That girl is gone now, absorbed into the legal identity of a man she's still getting to know. What remains is a Victorian wife, learning to navigate a world where survival means perfect submission, where happiness is secondary to duty, and where the greatest victory is simply making it through each day without causing scandal or disappointment. Sleep comes slowly in the big bed, with its heavy curtains drawn against the winter cold. Tomorrow will bring more lessons in household management, more practice in the art of being grateful for a life you never chose, and more opportunities to perfect the delicate balance between dignity and obedience that defines a successful Victorian marriage. But for now, in the quiet darkness, you can still remember what it felt like to be yourself. 6 months into your marriage, you're beginning to discover that the polished surface of Victorian respectability hides secrets that would shock the very society that created them. The morning light filters through your bedroom curtains, casting everything in that soft, golden glow that makes even the most ordinary objects look precious. But this morning feels different, weighted with knowledge you wish you didn't possess. It starts with small things. Charles has begun staying late in town more frequently, claiming business dinners and gentlemen's club obligations that keep him away until well past midnight. When he returns, he smells of cigars and something else, something musky and unfamiliar that clings to his clothes despite the winter air. You don't question him, of course. Victorian wives don't interrogate their husbands about their whereabouts. To do so would suggest a lack of trust that reflects poorly on your character, not his. So you smile and ask if he had a pleasant evening, and he kisses your forehead with the same distracted affection he might show a favourite niece. But Mrs. Pemberton, during one of your charitable committee meetings, lets slip a comment that chills you to the bone. Men will be men, she says, her voice carrying the weight of bitter experience. The important thing is that they come home to us eventually. The way she says it, with that particular emphasis on eventually, makes you understand that she's talking about more than late business dinners. She's talking about the other women, the ones who exist in the shadows of respectable society. You learn through carefully worded conversations and meaningful glances between the married women in your circle that Victorian men live by an entirely different set of moral rules than their wives. While women are expected to be pure, chaste, and completely devoted to their husbands, men are quietly understood to have natural appetites that occasionally require satisfaction outside the marriage bed. The prostitutes who work the theatres and music halls of London aren't just serving rough working men or bachelor gentlemen. Many of their customers are respectable married men, pillars of the community, churchgoers who preach about morality on Sunday and seek pleasure in brothels on Tuesday. This double standard is so deeply ingrained in Victorian society that it's barely even acknowledged as hypocrisy. Men are seen as having stronger physical desires that can't always be contained within the bounds of marriage, especially when their wives are pregnant, recovering from childbirth, or simply unwilling to participate in activities that bring them no pleasure. But here's the terrible secret that no one warns young brides about. These outside liaisons come with consequences that extend far beyond hurt feelings or wounded pride. Disease, you discover, travels both ways. Mrs. Hamilton, whose husband travels frequently for business, has been declining in health for months. Her skin has taken on a yellowish tinge, and she's developed a persistent cough that worsens week by week. The doctor visits frequently, but speaks only to her husband about her condition, following the Victorian custom that shields women from distressing medical details. but you've overheard enough whispered conversations to understand that Mrs. Hamilton is dying from what the doctor euphemistically calls a female complaint. What he doesn't say, what no one will say out loud, is that her husband brought this illness home from his business trips, like a souvenir from a particularly vicious vacation. Syphilis and gonorrhea, the scourges of Victorian sexuality, don't recognise the boundaries between respectable wives and fallen women. When a man visits a prostitute and then returns to his marriage bed, he can carry infection to a wife who has never been with another soul, who has followed every rule of purity and devotion that society demanded of her. The cruel irony is that these women often don't understand what's happening to their bodies. Victorian medicine shields them from knowledge about their own anatomy, their own diseases, their own reproductive systems. They suffer mysterious ailments, lose babies to miscarriage, battle infertility, and sometimes die young, never knowing that their symptoms have a name and a cause. Even more horrifying is the myth that sleeping with a virgin can cure a man of venereal disease. This folk belief, passed down through generations of ignorant desperation, leads some infected men to seek out young girls, sometimes children, believing that innocence can somehow cleanse their corruption. The result is a cycle of infection and suffering that touches even the most respectable households. Wives who have never strayed from the path of virtue find themselves battling diseases they don't understand, while their husbands continue to be welcomed in polite society without question. You think about this as you sit in your morning room, reading a letter from your sister who's still safely unmarried and living in your father's house. She writes about books she's reading, exhibitions she's attended, opinions she's forming about political matters. Her life seems impossibly free compared to yours, filled with choices and possibilities that feel like distant memories. The contrast makes you acutely aware of how much you've lost. Marriage was supposed to be the beginning of your real life, but instead it feels like the end of your authentic self. You've traded your independence, your legal rights, your freedom of movement, and your intellectual autonomy for security and social acceptance, and now you're beginning to suspect that even the security might be an illusion. Your own health has been uncertain lately. Nothing dramatic, just a persistent fatigue and some discomfort that you mention to Charles, but that he dismisses as typical feminine weakness. When you suggest calling the doctor, he assures you that such things resolve themselves naturally and that you shouldn't worry your pretty head about minor complaints. But you've been listening more carefully to the conversations of other wives, and you're starting to recognise patterns, the way Mrs. Thornfield excuses herself frequently during social gatherings, the careful way Mrs. Blackwood sits as if movement causes her pain, the drawn look around Mrs. Turner's eyes when she thinks no one is watching. These women are suffering in silence, bound by a code of respectability that prevents them from discussing their bodies, their health, or their marriages with anything approaching honesty. They hint and imply and speak in euphemisms, but they never say outright what everyone understands: that marriage for many Victorian women is a form of sanctioned victimhood. The physical abuse is perhaps the most carefully hidden secret of all. Victorian law explicitly gives husbands the right to correct their wives, and what constitutes reasonable correction is left largely to the man's discretion. A husband can hit his wife, lock her in a room, deny her food, or restrict her movements, and the law will support his authority as head of the household. You notice that Mrs. Blackwood always wears long sleeves, even on the warmest days. When she reaches for her teacup, you catch a glimpse of what might be a bruise around her wrist, dark purple against her pale skin. But when you ask if she's feeling well, she smiles brightly and changes the subject to the weather or the latest charitable cause. Mrs. Turner speaks of her husband with a deference that goes beyond mere respect. When his name is mentioned, she becomes smaller somehow, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, her hands folding protectively over her stomach. She mentions casually that she's clumsy, that she often walks into doors or trips on stairs, but the frequency of her accidents seems suspicious. These women have no recourse. Divorce is nearly impossible to obtain and carries such social stigma that it might as well be a death sentence. A divorced woman loses her children, her social standing, her financial support, and often her family's approval. She becomes a pariah, barely better than a prostitute in the eyes of respectable society. Even separation requires proving such extreme cruelty that most judges won't believe a genteel woman could endure it and remain sane. The legal system assumes that any wife complaining about her husband's behaviour must be hysterical, vindictive, or delusional. Her word carries no weight against his reputation as a gentleman. So these women endure. They develop elaborate explanations for their injuries, their illnesses, their sorrows. They support each other through meaningful glances and carefully coded conversations. They create secret networks of information and assistance hidden beneath the surface of their social obligations. You're beginning to understand that you've joined a sisterhood of silent suffering, a community of women who have traded their voices for respectability and discovered that the price was higher than they ever imagined. The realization comes fully one afternoon when you're going through Charles's correspondence to help organize his business papers. It's a task he's assigned you, part of your duties as a wife, and you're supposed to simply sort and file without reading. But one letter catches your attention because it's written in a woman's hand, the paper scented with cheap perfume that's nothing like the subtle fragrances used by ladies of your social class. The letter is brief and to the point. Ruby, apparently a young woman of Charles's acquaintance, is requesting financial assistance for what she delicately terms a delicate situation. She mentions their friendship and hints at consequences that might prove embarrassing to a gentleman of his standing. You sit in the silence of the study, holding this evidence of your husband's infidelity, and feel something break inside you that you didn't even know was still whole. Not your heart exactly, that was already cracked from the loneliness and disappointment of marriage. What breaks is your last illusion about the world you've entered. Charles, your kind and patient husband, has been living a double life. While you've been struggling to be the perfect wife, managing his household and supporting his social standing, he's been pursuing other women with the casual entitlement that Victorian society grants to men of his class. The woman writing this letter is probably younger than you, possibly desperate, certainly without the protections that your social class provides. If she's pregnant, as the letter seems to suggest, she faces a future of shame, poverty, and social ostracism. Charles faces no consequences at all beyond the minor inconvenience of providing some money to make the problem disappear. You carefully return the letter to its place among his papers and go about your afternoon duties as if nothing has changed, but everything has changed. You now understand that your marriage is not a partnership or even a companionship. It's a business arrangement in which you provide domestic services and social respectability in exchange for financial security and protection from the fate of unmarried women. Love, if it ever existed, was never really part of the contract. That evening, as you sit in the drawing room doing needlework while Charles reads his newspaper, you study his face in the lamplight. He looks exactly the same, kind brown eyes focused on the political news, occasionally commenting on some parliamentary debate or business development. But you're seeing him differently now, understanding that the man you married contains depths of selfishness and entitlement that your naive 18-year-old self never imagined. The worst part is that you can't even be angry with him. Not really. He's behaving exactly as Victorian society expects men to behave. He provides for you financially, treats you with public respect, and fulfills his social obligations as a husband. The fact that he seeks sexual satisfaction elsewhere, that he risks bringing disease into your marriage bed, that he casually exploits vulnerable women, these things are considered normal masculine behavior. You're the one who had unrealistic expectations. You're the one who somehow believed that marriage would involve mutual respect, shared affection, and basic consideration for your well-being. You're the one who was foolish enough to think that the romantic courtship meant something deeper than a successful business negotiation. The needlework blurs in your vision as tears you won't allow yourself to shed threaten to spill over. Victorian wives don't cry about their husbands' infidelities. They accept them gracefully, manage the household consequences discreetly, and maintain their dignity through all circumstances. So you blink back the tears and continue your embroidery, creating tiny, perfect stitches that will last long after everyone who might admire them is dead. Like all Victorian wives, you're learning to find meaning in small, contained activities, to take satisfaction in tasks that require skill but demand nothing dangerous like independent thought or personal expression. The clock on the mantelpiece chimes 9, and Charles folds his newspaper with the satisfied air of a man whose world is exactly as it should be. "Shall we retire, my dear?" he asks, and you nod and smile as if this routine brings you pleasure instead of resignation. In your bedroom, Sarah helps you out of your evening dress and into the white cotton nightgown that signals your availability for whatever Charles might require. The ritual has become mechanical, a series of movements performed without conscious thought or emotional investment. You lie in the darkness afterward, listening to Charles sleep peacefully beside you, and understand that this is your life now. Tomorrow will bring the same household duties, the same social obligations, the same careful performance of contentment. You'll plan meals and review accounts and receive visitors and pretend that your greatest ambition is to please a man who barely sees you as a complete person. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of Victorian marriage is how it teaches women to police themselves. You find yourself grateful for Charles's gentleness even as you resent his casual infidelities. You appreciate his financial support even as you mourn your lost independence. You value the social respectability of marriage even as you suffocate under its restrictions. This is how the system perpetuates itself, by making women complicit in their own oppression, by teaching them to be thankful for crumbs of consideration, by convincing them that any alternative would be worse than their current situation. You pull the heavy blankets up to your chin and try to find comfort in the warmth, in the solid walls around you, in the knowledge that you'll never be a homeless spinster dependent on reluctant relatives for charity. These are real benefits, genuine securities that many women lack. But as sleep finally begins to claim you, you allow yourself one moment of pure honesty. You think about the girl you used to be, the one who believed in love and choice and the possibility of a life shaped by her own desires. That girl is gone, dissolved into the legal identity of Mrs. Charles Whitmore, like sugar dissolving in bitter tea. What remains is a woman learning to survive in a world designed to contain her, to find satisfaction in servitude, to discover dignity in submission. Tomorrow you'll wake up and put on that identity again because it's the only one available to you now. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of your marriage bed, you can still remember what it felt like to be free. 2 years into your marriage, you discover that some Victorian wives have found their own solutions to impossible situations. The knowledge comes to you gradually, like a slow poison seeping through the walls of respectable society, carried in whispered conversations and meaningful silences between women who have learned to communicate in codes that men never bother to decipher. It begins with Mrs. Pemberton's sudden widowhood. Her husband, a robust man in his 40s who had never shown signs of illness, takes to his bed one Tuesday morning, complaining of stomach upset, and dies 3 days later. The doctor attributes his death to a virulent strain of influenza, but you notice how Mrs. Pemberton's relief seems disproportionate to her grief. She appears at the funeral in perfect mourning attire, her face composed in appropriate sorrow, but there's something different about her posture. For the first time since you've known her, she stands completely straight, her shoulders no longer curved in the defensive hunch that had become her trademark. When she speaks at the reception afterward, her voice carries a strength you've never heard before. Harold was a traditional husband, she says carefully, accepting condolences with the grace expected of a grieving widow, but when she thinks no one is looking, you catch her flexing her fingers as if testing their mobility, and you notice that the bruises around her wrists are finally beginning to fade. The second incident involves Mrs. Blackwood, whose husband meets with a similar fate 6 months later. Another sudden illness, another quick decline, another funeral where the widow seems more liberated than devastated. Dr. Morrison, the elderly physician who attends most of the prominent families in the district, begins making pointed comments about the unusual number of stomach ailments affecting married men this season. But his observations lead nowhere because Victorian law enforcement has little interest in investigating the deaths of respectable gentlemen who appear to have died from natural causes. The idea that their wives might have had anything to do with their demises is literally unthinkable to male authorities who view women as too weak and moral to commit serious crimes. You learn about the methods through conversations that never quite say what they mean. Women discussing the challenges of dealing with rats in their pantries, sharing recommendations for effective poisons that work quickly and leave little trace. Conversations about headache powders and the importance of keeping medicines clearly labelled. Casual mentions of arsenical compounds used in cosmetics and pest control. Substances so common in Victorian households that no one thinks twice about purchasing them. Arsenic, you discover, is called inheritance powder for good reasons. It's odourless, tasteless, and easily mistaken for indigestion when administered in small doses over time. A wife who knows her husband's habits, who prepares his food and serves his tea, who has access to his daily routines, can slowly poison him while appearing to be the most devoted of caregivers. The irony is bitter and perfect. Victorian society has trained women to be so focused on their husband's comfort and well-being that the perfect wife can commit the perfect murder simply by being too attentive to his needs. Not all the women who whisper about these methods are actually planning to use them. For many, just knowing that such options exist provides a psychological relief that makes their daily endurance possible. The knowledge that they could fight back, even if they choose not to, gives them a sense of agency in lives otherwise defined by complete powerlessness. But some do more than whisper. Some act. Mrs. Hamilton, whose husband has begun staying out entire nights without explanation, starts keeping a diary, not the sweet, innocent record of daily activities that young ladies are encouraged to maintain, but a detailed documentation of her husband's behaviour, his treatment of her, and the gradual deterioration of her health under his care. She writes in code, using initials and euphemisms that would mean nothing to a casual reader, but create a devastating record for anyone who knows how to interpret them. She notes the dates of his violent episodes, describes her injuries in clinical detail, and records the progression of symptoms that suggest he's brought disease home from his outside relationships. C returned late again, condition requiring attention to my person, she writes on a Tuesday in March. Injuries to left arm and shoulder area, applied cold compresses, symptoms of previous complaint returning. To anyone else, this might read like notes about a clumsy accident and a recurring illness, but Mrs. Hamilton is creating evidence that might someday save her life or explain her death. Other women adopt similar strategies. They hide money in household accounts, claiming small amounts for imaginary expenses and secreting the coins away in case they ever need to flee. They cultivate relationships with relatives who might provide shelter in an emergency. They learn about legal remedies that might theoretically be available to wives in extreme circumstances. But the legal system remains almost entirely closed to them. Divorce, even for women who can prove adultery, cruelty and abandonment simultaneously, requires legal proceedings that will destroy their reputations and leave them destitute. The few women who attempt it find themselves fighting not just their husbands, but the entire structure of Victorian society. Take the case of Mrs. Caroline Norton, a woman whose husband's abuse became so public that she couldn't hide it any longer. When she finally sought legal separation, her husband retaliated by claiming custody of their children and refusing to provide any financial support. The courts supported his right to do both, ruling that a woman who leaves her husband, even for the best of reasons, forfeits all claims to her children and property. Mrs. Norton spent years fighting for basic legal rights, writing pamphlets and lobbying politicians for reforms that would give women some protection under the law. Her efforts eventually contributed to the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, which theoretically made divorce more accessible. But in practice, the law remained heavily biased against women, requiring them to prove not just adultery, but additional offences like cruelty or incest before courts would grant relief. Even when women can prove extreme abuse, judges often dismiss their testimony as feminine hysteria or vindictive exaggeration. The legal system assumes that any woman complaining about her husband must be emotionally unstable or morally deficient. Her word carries no weight against his reputation as a gentleman, especially if he can present himself as a reasonable man driven to discipline an unreasonable wife. You learn these things through the network of women who have learned to share information without appearing to discuss anything more serious than recipes or household management. They teach each other which doctors might be sympathetic to female complaints, which lawyers might consider taking a woman's case, which relatives might provide temporary shelter for a desperate wife. But they also share darker knowledge, which poisons work most effectively, which accidents might befall abusive husbands, which symptoms suggest that justice might need to be administered privately since the law offers no protection. The most horrifying aspect of this hidden world is how normal it seems to the women who inhabit it. They discuss murder with the same calm practicality they use to plan dinner parties, weighing options and sharing advice with the efficiency of experienced household managers. The trick, Mrs. Pemberton confides during a quiet moment at another funeral, is patience. Men expect women to be emotional and impulsive, so they never suspect systematic planning. Her voice is conversational, as if she's discussing the best technique for training roses to climb a trellis. And consistency, adds Mrs. Blackwood, adjusting her mourning veil with hands that no longer shake. Small amounts, regular schedule, careful attention to symptoms. The appearance of devoted nursing care is essential. They speak like professionals sharing trade secrets, which in a way they are. Victorian society has trained them to be experts in their husband's habits, preferences, and vulnerabilities. They know exactly when he takes his tea, what foods he favours, which medicines he relies on for various complaints. They've spent years studying these men with the focused attention that comes from having their survival depend on predicting masculine moods and needs. Now, some of them are simply applying that expertise in a different direction. You listen to these conversations with a mixture of horror and fascination, understanding that you're receiving an education no finishing school ever provided. These women are teaching you that survival sometimes requires moving beyond passive endurance into active resistance, even when that resistance takes forms that would horrify the ministers who preach about feminine virtue and wifely submission. But you also realise that you're fortunate. Charles, for all his faults, has never raised a hand to you. His infidelities hurt your feelings and endanger your health, but he doesn't beat you, lock you in your room, or deny you food as punishment for imagined transgressions. Compared to some of the husbands these women describe, yours is practically a gentleman. This relative mercy makes your position more complex. You have grievances, but not grounds for the extreme measures that desperation sometimes requires. You're trapped in a marriage that disappoints and constrains you, but you're not in immediate physical danger. Your suffering is largely emotional and psychological, the slow erosion of selfhood rather than the acute crisis of physical abuse. So, you continue your daily routines, managing the household with increasing competence, fulfilling your social obligations with practiced grace, and maintaining the appearance of a satisfied wife while documenting your own experiences in a private diary that you hide beneath your jewellery box. Your entries are more circumspect than Mrs. Hamilton's detailed records, but they serve a similar purpose. You're creating a record of your authentic thoughts and feelings, preserving some evidence that the woman you used to be actually existed. Writing becomes a form of resistance, a way of maintaining your inner voice when your outer voice has been so thoroughly subdued. Today, C informed me that we would be entertaining his business associates next week, you write one evening, after a particularly frustrating conversation. He expressed surprise that I might have opinions about the menu, reminding me that such decisions are best left to those with experience in business matters. I smiled and agreed, as I have learned to do, but noted privately that I have been managing this household for 2 years and might have developed some expertise in entertaining guests. Each entry is a small act of rebellion, a quiet assertion that your thoughts and opinions matter even if no one else will ever acknowledge them. You write about your loneliness, your frustration with the limitations placed on your intellectual development, your growing understanding of how completely the law has erased your individual identity. But you also write about small moments of satisfaction, successfully managing a difficult dinner party, helping a servant's child when the local doctor was unavailable, reading a challenging book and forming your own opinions about its merits. These accomplishments may seem trivial compared to the achievements available to men, but they represent the full extent of agency available to a Victorian wife, and you've learned to take pride in mastering them. The diary becomes your confidant, the only place where you can be completely honest about your experiences. You write about the physical discomfort of marital relations, the emotional distance you feel from a husband who sees you as a pleasant but relatively unimportant part of his household, the growing awareness that your carefully cultivated domestic skills are appreciated mainly for their contribution to his social standing. Most importantly, you write about the other women, creating a record of their struggles and strategies that might someday prove valuable to other wives facing similar challenges. You document the coded conversations, the shared warnings about dangerous husbands, the network of support that exists beneath the surface of respectable society. Because you're beginning to understand that this sisterhood of silent suffering is also a sisterhood of quiet resistance. These women support each other through crises that can't be publicly acknowledged, share information that could save lives, and maintain connections that transcend the isolation imposed by their individual domestic arrangements. When Mrs. Turner appears at church with fresh bruises that her powder can't quite conceal, 3 different women find reasons to visit her during the week, bringing small gifts and staying just long enough to assess her condition and offer coded assistance. When young Mrs. Davies confides her fears about her husband's increasing violent temper, she receives invitations to tea that provide temporary refuge and practical advice about protecting herself. These interactions look like ordinary social visiting to outside observers, but they're actually part of an underground railroad for endangered wives, a system of mutual aid that operates entirely within the bounds of acceptable feminine behaviour. You're proud to be part of this network, even as you hope you'll never need to rely on it for your own survival. The knowledge that such support exists makes your own situation more bearable, and the opportunity to help other women provides a sense of purpose that your official domestic duties can't match. As autumn settles over the countryside again, marking your 3rd year of marriage, you realise that you've survived the transition from idealistic bride to pragmatic wife. You've learned to find satisfaction in small achievements, to take pride in competencies that society considers trivial, and to maintain your sense of self through private acts of resistance and documentation. You're not the woman you expected to become when you walked down the aisle in that white silk dress, but you're not the completely erased creature that Victorian law intended to create either. You found ways to preserve your identity within the constraints of marriage, to build meaningful relationships despite social isolation, and to exercise what limited agency is available to you. Tonight, as you prepare for bed, you feel a quiet satisfaction in your adaptation to circumstances you never chose but have learned to navigate with increasing skill. You've discovered reservoirs of strength you didn't know you possessed, developed strategies for survival that no one taught you, and found community among women who share your challenges. Charles sleeps peacefully beside you, unaware of the complex inner life you've developed or the network of female relationships that sustain you through the difficulties of marriage. He sees a dutiful wife who manages his household efficiently and supports his social standing appropriately. He has no idea that you've become something much more interesting and formidable than the sweet, compliant girl he married. The clock on the mantelpiece chimes midnight as you settle into sleep, grateful for the heavy quilts that protect you from the autumn chill and the solid walls that provide security even if they also represent confinement. Tomorrow will bring more of the same routines, the same careful performance of contentment, the same delicate balance between submission and self-preservation. But you'll face it with the knowledge that you're not alone, that other women have survived similar challenges, and that resistance takes many forms, some of them so subtle that even the most observant husband would never notice them. You've learned to be dangerous in ways that look like devotion, rebellious in ways that appear to be obedience, and strong in ways that men mistake for weakness. Sleep comes easily now, your breathing settling into the slow, steady rhythm of someone who has found peace within circumstances that once seemed impossible to endure. 5 years into your marriage, you witness something that changes everything. A woman who refuses to be silent. Her name is Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison, and she arrives in your district as the new vicar's wife, carrying herself with a confidence that immediately sets tongues wagging throughout the parish. Unlike the other wives in your social circle, Mrs. Morrison speaks directly to her husband during public gatherings, offering her own opinions on theological matters and community issues. She doesn't defer to his authority with the automatic submission that Victorian society expects. Instead, she treats him like an equal partner, someone whose opinion she values but doesn't automatically consider superior to her own. The shock this creates among the local families is palpable. During her first month in the parish, you overhear at least 3 different conversations questioning whether Reverend Morrison properly controls his household. The gentlemen express concern about the example such behaviour sets for other wives, while the ladies whisper about Mrs. Morrison's obvious lack of proper training in feminine deportment. But you find yourself drawn to her like a moth to candlelight. There's something magnetic about watching a woman move through the world with the kind of self-possession you remember having once, long ago, before marriage taught you to fold yourself into smaller and smaller spaces. Mrs. Morrison calls on you one Tuesday afternoon, following the social customs that require new residents to introduce themselves to established families. But instead of the stilted conversation about weather and household management that usually characterises such visits, she asks you directly what you think about the proposed changes to the poor laws currently being debated in Parliament. The question catches you so off guard that you almost spill your tea. No one has asked for your political opinion in 5 years. You've barely allowed yourself to form political opinions, understanding that such thoughts are irrelevant to your role as a wife. My husband follows such matters more closely than I do, you stammer, falling back on the safe response that deflects any suggestion that you might have independent thoughts about public affairs. Mrs. Morrison sets down her teacup and looks at you with the kind of direct attention that makes you feel slightly breathless. But surely you have observations about the treatment of poor families in this district. You work with the charitable society, don't you? You must see the effects of current policies on women and children who need assistance. And suddenly, you're talking, really talking, for the first time in years. You tell her about the families you've visited, the impossible choices facing women whose husbands have died or abandoned them, the children who go hungry because their mothers have no legal right to their father's property. You find yourself expressing opinions you didn't even know you had, drawing connections between individual cases and broader social patterns. Mrs. Morrison listens with the intensity of someone who considers your thoughts genuinely valuable, asking follow-up questions that demonstrate she's actually paying attention to your words rather than simply waiting for her turn to speak. The conversation lasts 2 hours and leaves you feeling more alive than you have since your wedding day. After she leaves, you sit in your morning room staring at the spot where she had been, marvelling at the experience of being treated like a complete person rather than a decorative accessory to your husband's life. You realise how starved you've been for intellectual engagement, how much you've missed the simple pleasure of exploring ideas with someone who respects your capacity for complex thought. Mrs. Morrison becomes a regular visitor, and through her you meet other women who are quietly challenging the restrictions that define Victorian femininity. They gather in each other's drawing rooms under the pretense of discussing charitable work or cultural improvement, but their real purpose is far more radical. They're educating themselves about legal rights, political developments, and social reforms that might improve women's lives. These meetings introduce you to women who are writing pamphlets about women's education, organising petitions for legal reforms, and corresponding with other reformers throughout England and Europe. They share books that challenge conventional ideas about feminine capabilities and discuss strategies for expanding women's opportunities within the bounds of respectability. You learn about Frances Power Cobb, who writes scathing critiques of coverture laws and advocates for women's right to control their own property. You read the works of Caroline Norton, whose personal struggles with an abusive husband led her to campaign for legal reforms that would protect other wives from similar treatment. Most inspiring of all, you discover Barbara Lee Smith Bodishan, who not only writes about women's rights but lives them, maintaining her own household and supporting herself through her writing even after marriage. These women are proving that alternatives to complete submission exist, that some wives are finding ways to retain their independence and dignity within marriage or to create lives outside it entirely. The knowledge that such women exist transforms your understanding of what might be possible for your own life. You begin to see your current situation not as a permanent prison, but as a temporary constraint that might someday be loosened or escaped entirely. Inspired by these examples, you start making small changes in your own behaviour. When Charles announces his plans for your social calendar without consulting you, you politely express your own preferences instead of simply agreeing. When household decisions affect areas where you have genuine expertise, you offer your opinions with quiet confidence rather than deferring automatically to his judgment. These changes are subtle enough that Charles barely notices them, but they represent a fundamental shift in how you understand your role in the marriage. You're no longer simply responding to his needs and wishes, you're asserting your right to have needs and wishes of your own. The transformation accelerates when you begin writing for publication. Mrs. Morrison mentions that the local newspaper occasionally prints letters from readers about community issues, and she encourages you to submit your thoughts about the charitable society's work with poor families. Your first published letter appears under the byline "A Lady of the Parish," following the convention that allows women to express public opinions while maintaining appropriate anonymity. The letter argues for more systematic support for widowed mothers and generates several responses from other readers, creating exactly the kind of public discussion that Victorian ladies are supposed to avoid. But the thrill of seeing your ideas in print, of knowing that strangers are reading and responding to your thoughts, is unlike anything you've experienced since your wedding day. You feel a sense of purpose and accomplishment that household management has never provided. a connection to the broader world that marriage had severed. Charles notices the letter and comments approvingly that it reflects well on his household's charitable commitments, apparently never suspecting that his wife might be the author. His assumption that you couldn't possibly have written anything worthy of publication both amuses and motivates you to continue developing your writing skills. Over the following months, you publish several more letters, gradually becoming bolder in your arguments and more sophisticated in your analysis of social problems. You write about women's education, about the need for legal protections for wives, about the economic pressures that force poor women into prostitution. Each piece represents a small act of rebellion against the silence that Victorian society imposes on married women. The writing also connects you to a broader community of reform-minded women throughout England. You begin corresponding with other female writers and activists, sharing ideas and strategies for advancing women's rights within the constraints of respectable society. These relationships sustain you through the ongoing challenges of marriage while opening new possibilities for personal growth and social contribution. You're still Charles's wife, still bound by the legal and social restrictions that define Victorian femininity, but you're also becoming something more, a voice in the growing movement for women's rights. The changes in your life coincide with broader social transformations that are gradually improving women's legal status. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 makes divorce theoretically more accessible, though still extremely difficult for women to obtain. The Married Women's Property Acts of the 1870s and 1880s will eventually give wives some control over their own earnings and property. These legal reforms happen slowly and face enormous resistance from men who benefit from the current system, but they represent genuine progress toward recognizing women as independent legal persons rather than property belonging to their husbands. You follow these developments through newspapers and correspondence with other reform-minded women, understanding that you're witnessing the beginning of a transformation that will eventually benefit women who are still children today. The changes come too late to fundamentally alter your own situation, but they offer hope for future generations of wives who might have more choices than you've had. The realization that you're part of a historical transition gives meaning to the struggles you've endured and the small acts of resistance you've managed. Your suffering hasn't been pointless, it's part of a larger story about women's fight for recognition as complete human beings, worthy of legal protection and social respect. This perspective helps you find peace with the compromises you've made and the limitations you continue to face. You're not the completely independent woman you dreamed of becoming as a girl, but you're not the erased non-entity that Victorian law intended to create either. You've found ways to maintain your identity, contribute to meaningful social change, and build relationships that sustain and inspire you. Charles remains largely oblivious to your intellectual and political development, seeing only the efficient household management and appropriate social behaviour that fulfill his expectations of a wife. In some ways, his blindness to your inner life protects you, allowing you to pursue activities that might alarm him if he understood their significance. But you've also come to see his limitations more clearly, understanding that his inability to recognise your full humanity reflects his society's failure to educate men about women's capabilities rather than any personal malice. He's trapped by Victorian masculine expectations, just as you're trapped by feminine ones, though his cage is larger and more comfortable than yours. This understanding doesn't eliminate the loneliness or frustration you feel in your marriage, but it helps you approach these challenges with greater equanimity. You've learned to find fulfillment outside your relationship with Charles while maintaining the appearance of contentment that social stability requires. The network of reform-minded women you've joined provides the intellectual stimulation and emotional support that marriage has never offered. These relationships prove that meaningful connections are possible even within the constraints of Victorian society, that women can support each other's growth and resistance in ways that transcend the isolation imposed by domestic arrangements. As your 10th wedding anniversary approaches, you reflect on the journey that has brought you from naive bride to seasoned survivor and secret rebel. You've learned skills that no finishing school taught, developed strengths that no one expected you to need, and found community among women who share your challenges and aspirations. The woman you've become is neither the romantic heroine you imagined as a girl, nor the completely subjugated wife that Victorian law intended to create. You're something more complex and resilient, a person who has learned to thrive within constraints, to find agency within restrictions, and to maintain hope despite disappointments. Your story is both uniquely personal and representative of thousands of other Victorian wives who found ways to survive and occasionally even flourish within a system designed to contain them. Some, like you, adapted by finding meaningful work and supportive communities within the bounds of respectability. Others, like the women who turned to poison, chose more dramatic forms of resistance when survival demanded it. All of you deserve recognition for the courage it took to maintain your humanity under circumstances that systematically denied your full personhood. The small acts of rebellion, the quiet networks of support, the gradual accumulation of legal and social changes. These things matter as much as the more visible struggles of famous reformers and political leaders. The sun sets earlier now as winter approaches again, casting long shadows across the countryside that has become genuinely familiar over the years. You've learned to love this landscape, these rooms, these routines that once felt like prison walls, not because they've changed, but because you found ways to inhabit them that preserve your sense of self. Tonight, as you prepare for bed, you feel grateful for the warmth of your house, the security of your position, and the meaningful work you've managed to create within the constraints of marriage. You've learned to appreciate the genuine satisfactions available to you while maintaining your commitment to expanding options for other women. Charles sleeps peacefully beside you, unaware that he's married to a woman who has become far more interesting and formidable than the girl he courted so carefully all those years ago. He sees a successful wife who manages his household competently and reflects well on his social standing. He has no idea that you've become a published writer, a political advocate, and a quiet revolutionary working for social change. The contrast between his perception and your reality no longer frustrates you as much as it once did. You've learned to find satisfaction in work that he'll never understand and relationships that exist entirely outside his awareness. Your private life has become rich enough to compensate for the limitations of your public role. As sleep begins to claim you, you think about the women who will come after you, the ones who might have more choices because of the work you and others have done to challenge unjust laws and social customs. They'll face different constraints and discover different forms of resistance, but they'll benefit from the foundation that your generation has laid. The fight for women's freedom didn't begin with the suffragettes, and it won't end with voting rights. It's an ongoing struggle that takes different forms in each generation, requiring new strategies as circumstances change, but maintaining the same fundamental goal: recognition that women are complete human beings deserving of dignity, respect, and the right to shape their own lives. Your contribution to that struggle has been quieter than some, but no less significant. You've proven that resistance is possible even under the most restrictive circumstances, that community can flourish even in isolation, and that hope can survive even the most disappointing compromises. The clock on the mantelpiece chimes midnight, marking the end of another day in a life that has turned out very differently than you expected, but not without its own forms of meaning and satisfaction. You've learned to be content without being complacent, grateful without being passive, and peaceful without being defeated. Tomorrow will bring new opportunities to support other women, to advocate for social reform, and to demonstrate that Victorian wives can be far more than the decorative, submissive creatures that society expected them to be. You'll continue the work of proving that women's voices matter, that their experiences deserve documentation, and that their struggles contribute to the long, slow progress toward justice. But for now, in the quiet darkness of your bedroom, surrounded by the solid walls that represent both security and constraint, you can rest in the knowledge that you found ways to live with dignity within circumstances you never chose but have learned to navigate with grace and determination. Sleep comes easily these days, your breathing settling into the steady rhythm of someone who has made peace with an imperfect world while maintaining the commitment to making it better for those who come next. You've discovered that survival isn't just about enduring. It's about finding ways to flourish even when flourishing requires redefining what success means. The Victorian era is ending, and with it some of the most restrictive constraints on women's lives. Change comes slowly, but it comes, carried forward by the accumulated efforts of women like you who refuse to disappear completely into their husbands' identities. You've been part of something larger than yourself, a movement that will outlive your individual struggles and create possibilities that you can barely imagine. And in the morning, when you wake to another day of careful negotiation between submission and resistance, you'll do so with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that your life has mattered, that your voice has been heard, and that your refusal to be silenced completely has contributed to a story that's much larger and more hopeful than any one woman's experience of marriage in Victorian England.